This recording is going to cover the hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary, otherwise known as the neurohypophysis. Now remember, the two hormones secreted by the neurohypophysis are not made there. They're actually made up in the hypothalamus. So you'll see on this picture, we say neurons in the paraventricular nuclei and neurons in the supraoptic nuclei. So I just want to briefly discuss those terms because it helps you with your terminology. Here is the optic chiasm here. Okay, so this here is the anterior pituitary, therefore this is the posterior pituitary. Well, we have neurons in the supraoptic nuclei, superior optic to the optic chiasm. That's where they're located. So those cell bodies are making ADH and oxytocin, and actually produces a lot more ADH than oxytocin. The neurons in the paraventricular nuclei, you see the cell bodies there. Para, kind of next to ventricular, the ventricle. So up in that area, we have the third ventricle that's filled with CSF. So that's why they call it paraventricular nuclei. Those cell bodies are producing ADH and oxytocin, and they actually produce a lot more oxytocin than ADH. Well, those two hormones will travel down inside these axons. So inside the axons, they're going to travel down. So you see right here, by way of what we call anterograde axonal transport, because we're going away from the cell body. So within the axon, these hormones are transported, and then they're stored here in the synaptic knob right here in the posterior pituitary. Under the right stimulation, it will be released into the bloodstream and then have its effects on target organs. So remember, the anterior pituitary gland, those hormones that were produced by the hypothalamus traveled down to the anterior pituitary gland and stimulated or inhibited the secretion of those, but it went through by way of the hypophyseal portal system. Neurohypophysis, those hormones are made up in the posterior pituitary, but made up in the hypothalamus, and then travel down via anterograde axonal transport, and then it will be released into the bloodstream under the right conditions. Now, one of the hormones that it does produce is called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. It's also referred to as vasopressin. So another term is vasopressin, and we'll talk about that why. So the biggest thing that it does is it targets particular components of the nephron tubule. And the nephron tubule, you see kind of right here, all this kind of coiled tannish area. It targets the late distal tubule, the cortical collecting tubule, and also, if I kept drawing, these would be the medullary ducts in the kidneys, and it increases the reabsorption of water because it increases the number of aquaporin channels, which allows us to reabsorb more water. If we don't reabsorb that water, the water stays in here and then ends up in the toilet. So as that fluid is traveled down the nephron tubule, if we want to get that water back, we can regulate it by ADH. More ADH, the more water we're going to reabsorb. So big thing it does, it increases water reabsorption in the nephron tubule, and it does it by increasing the number of those aquaporin channels. It also targets blood vessels, specifically the smooth muscle of blood vessels. And so when it does that, it triggers the contraction of that smooth muscle. And the end effect is you get vasoconstriction. So you see right here, vasoconstriction. The blood vessel constricts. Spell it out here. And so that would actually decrease amount of blood flow. It's going to play an important role in blood pressure. the regulation of ADH secretion? Well, let's think about it. Oops, sorry, same picture. Okay, so hands down, I'm going to box it. This is the most important regulator of ADH secretion. It is humorally regulated. And how it's regulated is by increased osmolarity or osmolality of the blood. So I want you to think of it as the blood's more concentrated. Why is it more concentrated? Well, it could be more concentrated because you added a lot of salt or some sort of solutes, or you've lost some fluid. So you'll notice up here, these are things that can cause the change in blood osmolality. If you eat a lot of salt, that can increase blood osmolality, or you're dehydrated, or you've lost some fluids, that can decrease the volume of the blood, and that can lead to an increase in blood osmolality. So an increased blood osmolality is actually detected by receptors located in the hypothalamus that are referred to as osmoreceptors. And osmoreceptors respond to that, and I'm just going to draw you a picture. So we'll say that's the osmoreceptor. And I just want to do a little brief review of osmosis because that's an important thing that you have to remember. Well, if that is a cell, and all of a sudden I had an increase in osmolarity in the blood, which is part of the extracellular fluid, I'm going to have a lot more solutes out here that in the cell. And so what's going to happen? Well, because of osmosis, water is going to go from its high concentration to low until it reaches equilibrium. The water is going to leave that cell. That cell will shrink. What happens if it's the osmoreceptor shrinks, what will result is you have an increased firing rate. So these are all in the nervous system. So increased firing rate, and this is what happens. You get firing rate, and that, remember, the synaptic knobs are located there in the neurohypophysis. It's going to increase the secretion of ADH. There's a thirst center in the hypothalamus, and so it increases thirst. So both of those together would help to increase blood volume, which, because of negative feedback inhibition, it's going to decrease blood osmolality. Once it gets back to where it should, then ADH secretion should go back. So ADH secretion is still subject to negative feedback regulation. So kind of like a quick thing, because I love talking about reflexes. So here's a reflex. And so we have our variable was the blood osmolality. We have a control center. And the control center is here in the hypothalamus. And we have our effectors. Our effectors would be the thirst center. Our effectors would be, I can go all the way down to the kidneys because we're stimulating the neurohypophysis to release ADH, which then targets the kidneys, and that's going to allow us to reabsorb that water. Your afferent pathway would be the bloodstream, and our efferent pathway would involve both the nervous system, neurons, because that will help the nervous system, as well as the bloodstream. Okay, so just kind of review some of the reflex there. Now, what about oxytocin? So oxytocin one of the things it targets is smooth muscle of various organs of the female reproductive system. So here, smooth muscle that's in the uterus. So this is the myometrium. It would also target the smooth muscle that lines the fallopian tubes. So why would that be important? Well, causes contraction of that smooth muscle. And when the egg is ovulated, it needs to travel this way. So it helps with the movement of that egg towards the uterus. During childbirth, this is going to be important for it to contract to get the kid out. So it's in the female, it's very important, and even when you have an orgasm, if the egg's been ovulated, it helps to kind of move the egg down towards where it's going to be implant into the uterus. During childbirth, it's important in we call parturition. Also in the female, same picture, is it targets myoepithelial cells in the breast. So the breast has mammary glands that produce milk. So I don't want you to confuse oxytocin and prolactin. Both target the breast, but specifically prolactin targets the glandular epithelium and stimulates the production of milk, while the myoepithelial cells are targeted by oxytocin. So myo means muscle. What it does, it stimulates the ejection of milk. We got to get that milk out. So both of those are important during breastfeeding, but one stimulates the production of milk while the other one promotes the ejection of milk. And actually oxytocin, I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but oxytocin is subject to positive feedback regulation, not at negative. It's positive feedback. Now, oxytocin is not just limited to the females. It's also important in the males. So it also targets smooth muscle in various structures of the male reproductive tract. So the vas deferens, or is what you see here, you see one of them because there's two of them, that transports sperm from this structure here called the epididymis, where sperm matured. Sperm was actually produced here in the testes, but after an orgasm, the sperm needs to be emitted. That means it's going to travel through the reproductive system and then ejaculated from the body. So contractions of the vas deferens is going to move it along here. You're also simultaneously have smooth muscle associated with some of the glands. You got one of the seminal vesicles here, which secretes some fluid that's going to help with feeding the sperm and some other things that we'll talk about when we do reproductive system. You got the prostate gland here in the male, which also produces some secretions, and that's going to help them to release their secretion and mix with the sperm, and then you end up with what we call seminal fluid. And then it's going to also obviously help with ejaculation to get it out. So I had mentioned previously the oxytocin is regulated by positive feedback regulation. Most of the ones we always talk about is negative feedback, but here it's positive feedback. You've probably heard about this when you did AMP1 with the role, say, oxytocin during childbirth. So positive feedback regulation, you're getting the response exaggerates or enhances the stimulus, and it doesn't kind of go back and dampen it. But here there's always a preset endpoint. So in the case of childbirth, once the kid is out, we don't need it anymore. The oxytocin is not going to be released. Same way with during an orgasm. When the fluid is released, we don't need it anymore. It stops. So there's always a preset endpoint. But I do want to mention one thing: the oxytocin has other known effects other than its effects on the reproductive tract. It has effects in the brain. It has been found to be involved in emotional bonding. They have found that there are some children with autism that have issues with oxytocin, and that's why they can't bond with people. But you can always look into that if you're more interested. But I talk about mainly more of its role in the reproductive system. So this is the end of this recording that covers the posterior pituitary gland's secretion of oxytocin and ADH.